now we begin our World Watchers. It's broadcast number 656, July the 2nd, 1984. This time last year, there were a lot of subjects that I brought up that are very, very pertinent in the news this week and the past weeks. Our time is getting a little bit closer. It's sort of like an accordion where it's all squishing together, and what was affecting us each year that I talked about had a relationship to what we're seeing and doing now. But this week they were squashed together with a lot of overlapping, so I'll spend time on the subject of what was happening last year and then go on to what's taking place right now. That was broadcast number 604, July the 4th, 1983. Last year I was talking about a meeting of Gordon Novell of the Central Intelligence Agency with Mitchell Werbell of the Defense Department and the CIA, Alan Bell, Colonel Alan Bell, his son, and G. Gordon Liddy of Watergate fame, and all worked with the CIA, the Defense Department. And there was a meeting they had discussing high technology and counterintelligence. All of these men worked for the past three presidents and were involved in offshore banking and insurance. And we talked about those three men just last July. An article that I got out of it was called Technology Illustrated that somebody sent to me from Boston, describing these characters, and all of them I believed were involved in the killing of John Kennedy in some way or another, or at least in the cover-up, or actively in the agencies with those people who participated in the killing. Now that was July last year, and in that interim, by November, late October, November, December, January, Mitchell Werbell, G. Gordon Liddy, and Gordon Novell all moved into the house of Larry Flynt as soon as he wanted to publish The Rebel and talk about who killed John Kennedy, the Nazi connections to who killed John Kennedy. And as soon as he met me, these people swiftly came into his home and into the Hustler magazine, were on the payroll, living at his house, weaving themselves in and out of the life of Larry Flynt, as well as Timothy Leary and a few other not suspicious characters, infamous characters. In addition to their being there, the very first day that I went to Los Angeles to the new offices of the Rebel, there was a man named Michael Stephen Canaly in the offices, and I was introduced to him. He wrote an article, or two-part thing, on the Nazis and Klan for Rebel magazine. But when I walked into the offices over there on Sunset Boulevard, here was this Canaly, and when he was introduced to me, that's the fellow I talked about on the program when I was down there that had the little doll, and they were going to play Hang the Rabbi, which was so cute, and their Nazi hats, their Luftwaffe hats, and so forth. This is the guy. I pulled out in one of the early articles I had, May 1981, about Canaly. Two Nazis admit setting ablaze at a synagogue. Two self-styled American Nazi Party leaders set fire to a Temple City synagogue last December in retaliation against the Jewish Defense League. And this was a story about Canaly, who described himself as a party commander, told local authorities that the local Nazis were so angered by the Defense League that in addition to burning synagogues, they were willing to kill school children. And I have a long article about Canaly and his link to the Nazis going back to that time period. Well, you can imagine how surprising it was to not only know that these creeps were in and out of Larry Flynt's life, but that this Canaly that I knew about was in the office. When I was introduced to him, I immediately recognized who the character was, and I told you, you remember, I said, "What are you doing here with Jim Good and these people down there at the Rebel office?" And he said, "Oh, shh, don't tell anybody." The people working around there didn't know his past. So what did he get? He got $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 to write 2 articles and was hanging around Larry Flynt's offices. I don't think that's what Larry set the Rebel up for. Of course, it closed shortly afterwards, but a year later, Larry Flynt, less than a year later, is in a federal penitentiary for various and sundry crimes that don't include murder and vulgarities. You know what happened to Larry Flynt, and getting a good mind control job on him and making him discredited in public, drugging him, I believe he was drugged, making him discredited in public, and certainly he was that. Also, in this past year, in June of 1984, there was an article by Richard Vagary, 5 reasons why Reagan is so important to be reelected. And he mentions how the High Court will have important decisions in the future, that members of the court are appointed for life and answer to no higher authority in government, yet their decisions have a greater impact than anything the President or Congress does. And Richard Vagary went on to say that they will make decisions and try to affect Hustler magazine, which is now available at corner newsstands. And he mentioned specifically Hustler and what I was writing about in the article that Larry Flynt published on JFK and the Nazis was Young Americans for Freedom. And Richard Vagary was a part, still is, of the YEF and the John Birch Society and the people behind the murder of Kennedy. So Vagary is saying we have to get our Supreme Court in, why Reagan's important to be elected, because then it'll affect, he specifically names Hustler magazine and Larry Flynt's crime. One of them was to publish about Larry MacDonald, the Birch Society, and the Young Americans for Freedom, and the Nazis and the murder of John Kennedy. So a year ago, I was talking about Novell and Werbel and Liddy, and then within the year, they moved in as soon as a magazine called Rebel was supposed to get off the ground. A year ago this week, I talked about an article in the Los Angeles Herald about the Zionists that make an effort to hide their criminal allegiance. This was published July 27, 1983. They want to hide their criminal allegiance with fascism in the past. The article was called Along the Road of Aggression and Racism, and speculation that the Zionists were formed at the expense of victims of Hitlerism, that they let some people die in exchange for having this country called Israel. And the Herald had a story, the Jews set up Israel, they were allowed to set it up as a puppet rump state of the Third Reich, and the Reichsbank set aside funds created in Palestine, which was a pro-Nazi Jewish state. And I was talking about that and have updated that story quite a bit. That was last year. Well, this week, Mr. Farrakhan, Reverend Farrakhan, the friend of Jesse Jackson, Louis Farrakhan, is saying that American support for Israel will start us into a third world war. And he quotes a book called The Transfer Agreement that just came out by Edwin Black, B-L-A-C-K. And he said the presence of the state of called Israel is an outlaw act. Many of you saw the article. He said the Zionists made a deal with Hitler before World War II so that German products would not be boycotted, and this was in exchange for 65,000 German Jews emigrating to Palestine. I was having a discussion with somebody this week about Farrakhan, and some Jewish people are very upset about Jesse Jackson and his relationship to Farrakhan. And I said, look, you can't have an opinion about them just based upon gut level of what they're saying, because you have to take the content of what they're saying. Is there validity in what they're saying? Did the Jews and the Zionists work with Adolf Hitler to form Israel? Could they have worked with Great Britain during the war and opposed Hitler in exchange for Britain promising them they would have Israel? Or did the Nazis and the Grand Mufti over there in Palestine that worked with Hitler and over there in the Middle East, did they have to work with the Nazis, Begin and his friends, the Irgun and the various terrorist groups? Why did they have to work with the Nazis when from 1933 on, they certainly knew everything that Adolf Hitler was going to do? The exterminations may have sped up. They were, the final plan, the Eichmann plan for the extermination, escalated, and was going full swing up till 1945, and maybe the idea came, I forget the exact date, of shipping people off for total genocide. But maybe it was 1940 when the conveyor belts began to put these people, millions, in the ovens. But from 33 to 1940, they had a lot of ways to know this was going to happen. And it is a fact that Israel has to now live with their relationships in the past. One woman that I was talking to, who's an attorney, said, but at the time, it was expedient, and they didn't know. And I used that quotation of Henry Miller when he was writing to Lawrence Durrell, the writer, and Gerald wanted to publish some books because he was starving and he could get them out faster. They weren't really good books, but then he'd have time with the money to write a good book. And Henry wrote him a letter and said, it's like giving your daughter out for prostitution because you're hungry, and then you recycle her, and as soon as you have enough money to support yourself, you try to pass her off as a virgin. You do your best, even if you starve, if you have a best. And certainly there are people, Zionists today and Zionists in the past. And not only is the past that we're talking about, but the present today. They're entertaining all the Nazis, the fascists, the Zionists today, arming the right-wing dictatorships all over the world. So it's a matter that happened then, but it hasn't stopped, and that's the dangerous part about it. Last year, the Cartergate papers, the briefing papers, were very much in the news. These stories said how Reagan used the books, Jimmy Carter's books, to take advantage of his debates, how the papers were photocopied before October 28, 1980, and Fred Fielding, who had the role of John Dean in the Watergate case. Fielding is the counsel for the White House, and he was there with the whole Watergate team and survived it, just like Mr. Casey did of the CIA and a lot of other people. Fielding dropped the inquiry into how Reagan got the books and was coached to appear knowledgeable about the subjects they were discussing when they had stolen papers, and they also took papers from the National Security Agency and so forth, so that he would jump the gun and be knowledgeable what to answer, and Jimmy Carter could bring up subjects, or the League of Women Voters and Reagan throughout the whole election. Actually, the CIA director, the future CIA director, was in part stealing these papers to coach the president-to-be, and then he would be appointed CIA director, and Robert Keith Gray's names were on there, and William Casey and other people. So, and this week, this case has gone on for a whole year. This week, the Attorney General had the power to bar the special counsel, and that was held up in court. It's gone on for a year, and William French Smith said that I don't have to have an independent counsel for what happened in 1980. Now, this is a conflict of interest. He's the president's attorney. The president made him attorney general, and many of you read the story that there was a decision made, an unsigned 7-page opinion. They're too chicken, you know what, to sign their name to it, from the U.S. Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia. And the New York Times says the use of 8 judges to decide the case bypassed the usual approach of having 3 judge panels hear the case. They used a tricky bypass so they wouldn't have the regular panel listen to the case. The appellate court said that the factual information in the possession of the Attorney General was sufficiently specific and credible to trigger the Attorney General's statutory duty to investigate. This is from the New York Times, June 26, 1984. The Ethics in Government Act was passed in response to post-Watergate concerns that when you have a Justice Department headed by a presidentially appointed Attorney General, and if he can't be trusted to do impartial investigation, you get a special prosecutor. But the Attorney General says, I won't do it, period. The law provides that a special 3-judge court must appoint an independent counsel whenever the Attorney General seeks one, but they can't have any power to do it otherwise. So there's your catch-22, and many of you have read that in the paper. The purpose of the 1978 Ethics Act would be frustrated if a recalcitrant Attorney General were able to stonewall to prevent the appointment, and that was what William French Smith did. Judge Green said the 4 Democrats on a congressional investigating panel said that the known facts of the matter suggest that crimes such as theft and illegal receipt of government documents may have been improbably committed. These crimes were committed, but now they have stopped the court. 8 people, unsigned, their names are in the newspaper, a Mr. Banzoff and another person, Peter H. Myers, wanted this case to continue and open it up, the famous Debategate. And they said, we'll probably never learn whether people like CIA Director William Casey lied in connection with the involvement. Today's decision that the court had should prompt Congress to amend the ethics law one more time to provide for lawsuits so that they can sue if there is still a cover-up. If you need a special prosecutor to open up a case and the Attorney General is protecting his own team, then the Attorney General decides whether or not you need a prosecutor. So I think you get the idea. William French Smith investigated the first time, and then he turns down the special prosecutor, saying, you can't go into what I did, even though these lawyers have studied it for 1 year and say there's evidence of it. Now, a year ago this week, I was referring to a Los Angeles Times article called Police spy case figure is silent about his activities. That was J. Paul sharing the files with Western Goals and the computer system from the Los Angeles Police Department to Alexandria, Virginia, and linked to mafia bosses, Nazi death squads, fascist fronts, and so forth. The Western Goals is linked to the LAPD, and just a year ago, J. Paul was being very silent. Now, that was in July. In September, a short time later, Representative Larry MacDonald was killed, September the 1st, 1983, the head of Western Goals. And the second point is that the LAPD had a huge multi-million-dollar lawsuit of 131 plaintiffs against the LAPD. They quickly settled out of court almost $2 million. And again, they used the attorneys of Ronald Reagan and the office of William French Smith. But they would rather not go to court on their spying activities. They'd rather pay these radicals, they call them such radicals, and settled out of court. So in 1 year, within this short time, the case never went to court, and the primary witness of the story was killed September the 1st, and that was in the news last year. Another story we talked about last year was the book, The Price of Power, by Seymour Hersh. It's called The Price of Power, Kissinger and the Nixon White House Years. And that book, incidentally, goes into, around page 19 and 20, Henry Kissinger and Oberammergau with the top Nazis and his role being with them right after the war and how they were rounded up in the enclave where Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer were. Now, this book got a lot of attention. Harding Carter III said Hersh will be honored by history and his colleagues for exposing Kissinger and his prince, Richard Nixon. There was another quotation, Kissinger betrayed President Johnson, Cyrus Vance, and others in high places while passing secret information to the Nixon campaign. It's like the Reagan Gate all over again, or Cartergate, passing them on. Reagan, as National Security Advisor, has undermined the Secretary of State, William Rogers, and this was a book that came out just last year about this time. What happened in that time to update this year? Henry Kissinger took over Senator Henry Jackson's commission that was to investigate the problems in Central America. Senator Henry Jackson died the same day that Larry MacDonald died, September the 1st, 1983. Senator Jackson was always referred to as the senator from Boeing from Washington. He was the main lobbyist in the United States Congress for the Boeing airplanes, and it was those airplanes that were manufactured and identical, almost identical, that went down. One went down and one flew back to safety when Larry MacDonald was killed. The Boeing was the 135, the nickname for the KAL 135, the spy plane, was a Boeing airplane, and that went down. The KAL 007 went down with Larry MacDonald, but the almost identical plane, the Boeing airplane that went side by side, went back to the United States into safety. Kissinger took over Jackson's Committee in Central America, and then instead of being honored by history and so forth for exposing Kissinger, Ronald Reagan immediately put him on Alfred Bloomingdale's seat of the Intelligence Advisory Board. So he got promoted at two places, and he's the main spokesman for NBC, ABC, and CBS Radio. If any news events come, and he's now running a syndicated column for many newspapers. It's covered in the London Times, the Los Angeles Times, the San Jose Mercury. He is very much in full swing, and all the efforts of Seymour Hersh were completely ignored. The scandals around Kissinger. And Richard Nixon also is interviewed publicly, and his face is in almost one paper every single day that I read. Now, Time magazine, July the 2nd, 1984, to update the Seymour Hersh story, has now been asked by the Soviet Union to investigate the Korean airline 007. That would be an interesting project. As I say, Time magazine mentions that article in the Defense Attaché that came out in London about a week and a half ago, and how the Korean airline was on a spy mission. And Time says Moscow certainly remains eager to promote its version of events, which they said at the beginning of when the plane went down, it was a spy plane. And Time refers the tragedy as still a mystery. And the Soviet Union has taken the unusual step of allowing a well-known U.S. investigative journalist Seymour Hersh to interview the Soviet chief of staff and to visit the Soviet air base. Now, that could go one of two ways. Seymour Hersh wrote about the murder of Salvador Allende, and I believe it was Atlantic Monthly, and said that the CIA wasn't involved in the murder of Allende. Later, he backtracked and changed it, but it was quite a shock to hear him take that position at first. But now he's been asked to talk and investigate the Korean airline. He's done extensive work, 5 to 6 years, on the book on Henry Kissinger. He knows full well the menace of Kissinger. So Seymour Hersh is now jumping from Henry Kissinger last year at this time to the Korean airline, which is current at this time, and of course it tangles with the Los Angeles Police Department and the various offices around the world of Western goals. Remember the events that were so important last year, because there's so many articles in the news and they'll just go like Vesuvius, boiling over and over continuously. The murder of John Paul I that will update from time to time, the Korean airline, the excuse for the Cold War to maybe escalate the hot war, and also the story about Ajah trying to kill Mehmet Ajah of the Grey Wolves, the Nazis, the fascists, and the dope dealers trying to kill the Pope, because that would escalate the Soviet Union and the bestiality of the Soviet Union. So the anti-Soviet act of promoting for 3 years this story, the Korean airline being shot down with Larry MacDonald of the Birch Society on it, and then, of course, the Olympic Games and the chance for terrorism there has been in the news continuously, and the Grenada invasion, which was a test case for future islands or even for the United States someday. Those stories will always be in the news, and we'll update them as much as we can each week. Now, the Los Angeles Times had a story that was also carried in the L.A. Herald that I thought would be of interest to you. It has to do with Mr. Peter Ueberroth, the head of the Olympic Games. He's the Olympic chief in Los Angeles. And he came out this week and called Chief of Police Gerald Gates similar to a Nazi. He says he's a Nazi at heart. He didn't come out and call him a Nazi. Well, I have no particular love for Peter Ueberroth, and I had the feeling that if a coup were to happen, he has the right contacts also to allow it to happen in this country and a lot of terrorism to begin. But Ueberroth evidently didn't like the LAPD role of offering safe houses to defectors, of having these violent radical groups from Eastern Europe and the Klan and the Nazis and all the groups offering safety to the athletes from the Eastern countries. And Ueberroth wanted a successful Olympics. I believe he's accused Gerald Gates of not giving the proper security to certain places around town. Now, it's 2 weeks before the Olympics, and he's comparing Gerald Gates to a Nazi, and he won't retract the story. And Gates has a story in the Herald. All these people are coming from all over the world for the Olympics, and I'm described as a possible Nazi. In the L.A. Times, Gates said that he was mentioned as a possible candidate for mayor. The remark could have a tremendous impact on what I might be able to do in the future. Nobody wants to hire a Nazi, and no one wants to vote for a Nazi. Well, Gates hired some Nazis to help him with the security of the Los Angeles Olympics, and apropos of those remarks that they're challenging each other, one was on Good Morning America or the Today Show, Mr. Ueberroth calling the chief of police in L.A. a Nazi. You've heard how many links I've made on broadcasts of Western goals to the actual planning of the massacre in Munich in 1972 and the Nazi organizations. Louis Tackwood of the Los Angeles Police Department, a defector, just a year before the Watergate story broke, said that the Los Angeles Police Department under Gerald Gates and Ed Davis was their goal was a Gestapo. That's printed in the book The Glass House Tapes, published by Avon Press. I wrote in 1974 with the SLA as the CIA the link of the Munich massacre to the Los Angeles Police Department and the phony terrorist scare in the United States as an excuse to introduce the SWAT teams. And Gates has brought in people for security that we've had on the air many times in the last year who were actually part of Adolf Hitler's security and Nazi teams to be down in Los Angeles for these Olympic Games. Now, is it possible that Mr. Ueberroth is catching on, that there's a little more planned than what he anticipated, and that there are not only similarities to the regime in Nazi Germany, but there are Nazis from Germany who are involved in Los Angeles and with the police department and with Western goals, and have been for a long time, who have a finger in the so-called security of the Olympics. So he, from a point of knowing what he's talking about, I think he felt safe and would not apologize that the chief of police is acting like a Nazi, has the heart of a Nazi, but doesn't hesitate to use the word. Now, a gentleman died this week. You may not remember his name. Some of you might. James R. Thornwell. He died June 28, 1984. It was reported in the San Francisco Chronicle. You might have seen him on 60 Minutes, and his importance is obvious to you. When I go into the subject, you might remember Thornwell was 46 years old when he died. He was the subject of an Army LSD experiment, and last week he drowned. An apparent seizure, like an apparent heart attack. He might have had an epileptic seizure in a boat. He was swimming in a pool, according to his wife, and they said there's no evidence that his death was related to the LSD experiment. Now, he had a multi-million-dollar suit against the United States Department of Defense. They took this black man to a chalet in France and gave him LSD. He didn't know it, had this substance, didn't know it. He got out of the Army. He was crazy. He got well. He went crazy. He came home. He lost a job. He got well. He lost another job. He had recurrent seizures and episodes through the years. He got married, he divorced, and 16 years after the experiments, the Army admitted that he was a subject of this LSD. And of course, the daddy of the LSD experiments was Timothy Leary. A lot of people tell me that Timothy Leary was innocent. Another fellow hanging around at Larry Flynt's house, his pictures in all the magazines, The Hustler and also Rebel. Picture, I'm sorry all that happened. Rebel would have to close with these people around there, obviously. But here's the LSD. People say, well, that doesn't affect you. Why would the Army give this man over $600,000 a settlement? He came from South Carolina, $625,000, because what they gave to him is recurrent, does happen again, and he just conveniently drowned last week, so he's not around, the living proof that it isn't a one-time thing that you give to somebody and then they have one bad trip and get over it, and any other problems they have later are unconnected. The Army admitted that it is 16 years and then now into the future, the seizures and so forth were the result of chemicals added. It's not pure LSD any more than, say, an aspirin you can have, and then if you add other chemicals, it isn't an aspirin anymore. It's called LSD, but they made a settlement with him of $625,000. And now he died of an apparent epileptic seizure out in California in a Vallejo swimming pool. It's too bad that he couldn't remain alive so that we could see him when he's 40, 50, 60 to see if what they did to him in France is still acting and gets in the bloodstream and you can't kick it at all. This was a terrible thing. They admitted what they did, and the formula that they had, I assure you, is still around. Now, I just want to update a quick story on MARC, Rich and Company. I talk about it all the time. Mr. Davis is trying to buy his 50% of 20th Century Fox. It owns Pebble Beach. Marvin Davis, the oil tycoon, he wants to buy Mr. Rich's stock. But the point is, he hasn't bought it back yet, and they are partners. He's bought 50% of 20th Century Fox and the entire Pebble Beach area and a lot of property up here. The two articles quickly, if I can do them in 2 minutes. One is from the London Times, Pretoria facing oil deal scandal. This is from Johannesburg. And this has to do with South Africa has an oil purchasing agency called the Strategic Fuel Fund, SFF. And they keep track of their money because there's an oil embargo against South Africa because of the genocide. And South Africa is paying 220 million pounds more, which is approximately $440 million more than they had to, not the cost of the oil, to somebody for what the London Times says is a scandal ready to explode, a big corruption scandal. It was at that point when the scandal broke that Mr. Botha, the Prime Minister of South Africa, quickly went to England to see Margaret Thatcher. Now, the man supplying the oil, wouldn't you know, according to the dossier handed over by an opposition leader, said that the money paid, that 220 million pounds, $440 million, more than the contract, has to do with old Mark Rich, the man who put Henry Kissinger on the board of 20th Century Fox, and William Rogers, that was the board with Grace Kelly, and Madame Chenault. Wouldn't you know that there they are, Kissinger and company, selling South Africa the oil and making 440 million plus. So the London Times, not our local paper, but he has property up here, not the LA Times, only the London Times, said that the problem, the scandal in South Africa, is the money that Mr. Rich has made over and above what the oil cost. And the scandal, of course, is that American who left this country owing many, many millions in back taxes, the largest single case we ever had, the partner of Henry Kissinger is now hiding in Switzerland, won't answer the courts, and he's involved with sending the oil to South Africa. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I'll get back to that subject in a minute. Now we'll go back to the second half of broadcast number 656. It's July the 2nd, 1984. Going back to Mark Rich and the scandal in South Africa, which is horrendous, ripping us off and not paying his taxes here. He pays $50,000 a day, I've mentioned it before, because he refuses to turn over the records in the government tax fraud investigation. He's already paid $17.56 million to the United States government. Well, if there's $440 million plus that he made off of South Africa, he doesn't have to answer this United States for a long time, because maybe the poor South Africans are giving him the money, because this may be the link of the Broider Band and the Nazis and Henry Kissinger and even some of those Nazi Jews in Israel who armed South Africa. They have a vested interest in, no matter what amount, the court in England has this matter, and in the United States District Court, District Judge Leonard B. Sand, he has upheld the $50,000 a day fine for Mark Rich. Now, you know, you have to have some pretty good secrets to keep that one from being in the news, and that's what he's doing. Another story sent to me by a listener, World Watchers from Barron's, June the 10th, 11th, 1984. Mark Rich and ARCO, their dealings stir a court fight. And it says back in 1979 and 1980, when oil trader Mark Rich was wheeling and dealing at the crest of the boiling international oil market, one of his prime customers was the Atlantic Richfield Company, ARCO. Now, the Richfield Company have been close to Henry Kissinger and William Rogers and Marvin Davis. And here we have again the Richfield Company, ARCO. How many other oil companies are supplying all the fascist countries in the world? And this article in Barron said that by something about the company's deals with Mark Rich must have troubled ARCO, because as early as 1981, this is 3 years ago, its lawyers launched an internal investigation of crude oil transactions with Mark Rich. They got suspicious. Now Rich is a fugitive in Switzerland, his current haven from federal criminal charges, tax evasion scams. Isn't that a nice person to be a 50% partner of 20th Century Fox with all the other cast of characters, as I say, Henry Kissinger particularly on the board. Oh, yes, and Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission, who's on the board of directors of this group with Mr. Mark Rich and Marvin Davis. So the Richfield Company, I'll do more of that later and update you on the Richfield story. It's very important of the links of Mr. Anderson of Richfield to Henry Kissinger. But Kissinger I believe, is this strong Nazi that came from Oberammergau with the top Nazis, hiding himself as a Jewish Nazi. Let's say he's Jewish and he's still working with them. But Kissinger is involved in every dirty deal, every fascist dictatorship, whether it's the murder of Allende, the murder of Bhutto in Pakistan, the narcotics traffic, Klaus Barbie in Bolivia, all over the world, the narcotics from Pakistan, from Southeast Asia during the war we had in Southeast Asia. Henry Kissinger is into oil scams, raising our oil prices, if you see what they are today and can imagine the future, narcotics, oil scams, skimming from countries, money linked to the P2 and Licio Gelli, with Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig and that gang. These are crummy people whose names surface all the time in current investigations, so I did want to mention the London Times story and also the Barron's story. They don't mention Henry Kissinger, but he and Gerald Ford and are close to Mark Rich, and I say Marvin Davis. Now, for the remaining of the time, I want to finish. I won't ever finish the subject, but I want to complete part 2 of the Korean airline that I did the week before last, June the 18th, 1984. I don't want to leave it dangling because there were 2 stories in the London Times, May the 20th, and one May the 27th, and I wanted to continue on that story because it is so terribly important, and particularly since I wrote the article for Larry Flynt on the Korean airline and the belief that that was a kamikaze affair because it was meant to go down with Larry Flynt on that plane, and I want to follow news stories to see if they support that or if they are against it. I'm reading them all. I'm not skimming it for you, but I do want to go into that story as much as I can in the weeks to come, and as the London Times story said, and I mentioned it, no incident has caused more outrage, and it was an event, this was that quote I had 2 weeks ago, that fitted only too well with the twisted political myths of our time. It reinforced Reagan's claim that the Soviet Union is nothing but an empire of evil. Now, if some of you have that calendar, 1984, with memorable dates on it, June 25th, just last week, in 1968, Look magazine reported, in terms of the future 1984, that American Airlines, and I'm sure others did it too, but they wanted this in 1968, American airline computers kept files on their past passengers, not just because you take a plane now and they want to know who you are, but whoever took a plane on that airline and the flight that they traveled and their seat number, the time of day, and the telephone contact for hotel reservations, and they use these files. 10 to 15 different investigators can have access to those files of where people traveled and so forth. Well, I mentioned 2 weeks ago that Korean airline emanated from New York City, from Kennedy Airport, with the American Airlines. So Larry MacDonald was, they knew where he was sitting, who he was traveling with, and so forth. The American airline that was spying back in 1968 and keeping those files for their future computers as well as the current flights. That was the airline, the home base of the Korean airline is the American Airlines in New York City. I also mentioned that Continental Airlines in Los Angeles fixed out the navigational system, the computer work that was supposed to be foolproof when Larry McDonald's airplane left Anchorage, Alaska for South Korea. June 14th, 1984, there's a story from the San Francisco Chronicle. Pilots want a thorough probe of Continental Airlines. The Airline Pilots Union is embroiled in a bitter dispute, and they claim that the Federal Aviation is covering up safety violations, that they are permitting the unsafe operation of the air carrier to continue. Was one of their unsafe operations having the wrong computer information that didn't sync with the VOR radio that didn't go off up in Anchorage, Alaska when Larry McDonald sailed out in the wild blue yonder. That's one of the stories. There's another story about Continental Airline right after that. This is June 14th. 1 week later, a judge gives them a big victory that they can break up the union of the pilots. Maybe they were so nice to accommodate the disinformation for the Larry McDonald plane. They had to get some reward. I'm just giving a hypothetical or asking you a question. Is it possible 1 week later, because supposed bankruptcy problems they were having, they ruled out the union, canceled its contract with the pilots union, and told them they didn't need to keep the financial arrangement they had before. I'm sure they have financial problems, and I'm sure that other airlines have too, but I thought it was interesting or coincidental that both American Airline and Continental were mentioned in context of what can happen in 1984, and also that they're not safe, and the pilots are claiming that they are a danger. Specifically, they mentioned the Continental Airline. The Wall Street Journal, June 19th, has an editorial by Mr. Kravitz, C-R-A-V-I-T-Z. He's the editorial, charge of the editorial of the Wall Street Journal. This is Gordon Kravitz, I-T-Z. And it's about a newspaper in Greece published under the auspices or continuously under Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou. And they suggest, how far leftist this is and his attitude towards NATO. And they cite the examples of how bad the newspaper is in Athens by saying that they even published assertions such as the Korean Airlines flight was a deliberate provocation by the CIA to spy on the Soviets, who had the right to shoot it down. And they also published the Poland Solidarity, worked for the CIA and the mafia-backed Vatican, and the Pope's trip to Poland in June '82. This supposed peace meet was unreported in Ethnos. Now, if two things didn't turn out to be true, but these two, the spy plane, it always was obvious to most people, and the fact that the Pope gave, one story was $50 million, later it was $100 million, to Solidarity. You can see that in the book, in God's Name, the activities of Solidarity in the Vatican. So even currently, the editor on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal has over a quarter of a page, almost half a page of the newspaper on how terrible the newspapers are in Athens to print these things, and yet the everyday newspapers outside the Wall Street Journal have stories confirming what was printed in Athens just a year ago. Now, the London Times story that I wanted to update, part 2, I'll run down quickly some of the points that I don't want to miss when we go on to other subjects next week, because I left that dangling. I do this all the time, and I decided I wasn't going to do this anymore. No matter how important the news is, I'm going to get back to where I left off for at least one more week, because it should fit together, but we had 1 week interim there where I didn't do it. This was the second part of an article by Murray Sale. And the interesting thing, this had nothing to do with the defense magazine that came out about the Korean airline and its spying. This was a private article written for the London Times, a 2-part story. And this author goes into great details. And then when he gets the facts, he can't explain them. And everything becomes hazy and hypothetical. And he has to come up with possibilities. He says first that the doomed airplane passed near Bethel. That was their first stop where they were to send a routine message to Anchorage, and everything was absolutely all right. It didn't say anything was wrong, even though the plane was off course within 10 minutes after the time it left Alaska. The NABIF is the next reporting point, and I mentioned that to you. You might remember, and we'll pick up with some of these points. This is all but infallible. They were to go over the ocean. It's dangerous from there. It's of utmost importance. They were off course, and at this point, they were not told that they were going into a dangerous area and were not alerted. And the programming, the INS was programmed before takeoff. It was checked. The waypoints, they're called waypoints, are where they invariably check in. It's compulsory, and there's an amber light that goes on that tells them when they're just about to arrive, 1 minute before the point where they check in, and 2 minutes after. And then Mr. Sale just gives all kinds of confused reasons why the pilot or the co-pilot or the third pilot couldn't see the amber light for, I don't know what. The lighting was bad all of a sudden on this fail-safe system. He said pilots or co-pilots normally handle radio communications, and they estimate the flight time at the waypoints and get this information, and these alert lights tell them along the way what to do. Then he says, suppose that the automatic pilot is coupled, not to the INS, but to some other source of direction. Suppose, this is where he begins sort of like the probablys or the supposes, because there's no other way to explain a fail-safe, and he says the alert lights would still come on if the aircraft is a beam of the waypoint, less than 200 miles away. And he claims the lights went on, but they weren't aware or cognizant of seeing them. He said the crew believed that they were crossing the correct point as they went further and further off course. When the lights came on, they followed the common practice and reported themselves at corresponding waypoints, and the last position they referred to as 185 miles off track, and they were misled, but they still kept sailing on. He said the KAL the autopilot could not have been coupled to the flight plan that was programmed into the 3 systems, nor could it have been coupled to the radio beam, which we said wasn't working. Now he says the only other possibility, which I mentioned, was that magnetic head guiding them. But he said this is very, very rare, a very rare occurrence, that the failure of these two not coming together, he repeats again, is a rare occurrence. Then he tries to give excuses what happened, and this is where it gets interesting. He gives about 4 or 5 excuses. He says the pilot may have forgotten what he was doing. That's one of the excuses, that he may have forgotten. about the system and that they weren't connected to each other. Or there might have been a misunderstanding of a kind not unknown in aviation between the captain and his co-pilot. Or he could have been downstairs talking to Larry MacDonald, which I mentioned because he knew in advance that this prominent president of the John Birch Society in Congress was on his airplane. Or he may have greeted his off-duty colleagues, 3 captains. Now, because whoever was flying the plane was telephonically in touch with Japan until the moment it went into the ocean, they already know that the main pilot evidently wasn't sitting in his chair because they say he could have been visiting one or he could have been visiting the other. Now, I won't go into the details of how the Soviet Union tests their airplanes, but the important thing is that when they make tests in the Pacific, they normally communicate to Japan, and Japan warns the other civil and commercial airlines, and the American Airlines, it's not the company American Airlines, but the planes flying over there, that something is happening in that vicinity. They are nice enough to say something is happening in this vicinity, and we were nice enough to go right over it. And this is the important part of the story. He says, when you study the information, they realized that the pilot was talking all the time to Japan, which I mentioned, and he's not concerned. He's very normal. And the Soviet Union said that they were firing cannon bursts and giving them notice of some kind. But it says at the very instant that the co-pilot of KAL 007 had his headphone on and his chart flight was lit up, he was receiving a message from Tokyo at exactly the same time. By an evil coincidence, at the very minute 007 was talking to Tokyo, First Officer Sons, S-O-N-S, not Chung, the main pilot, was still calm and unhurried. Now, that's what I wrote about. I finished that article at the end of October, but Larry didn't publish it until February because there were about 60 footnotes that they wanted to look up to make sure for legal purposes that they wouldn't be sued, because that was pretty far ahead to have an article ready within a month on the problems with that airplane and the possibility of the kamikaze. Now, a smart person into mind control could be talking to that man and telling him what to do, like sail forward and keep going your course no matter what you see. Remember the controller, Candy Jones, how she gets instructions on the telephone and takes whatever they say to do. Even she was told to go down to Paradise Island and jump off a certain place and kill herself. And her husband, Long John Nebel, a radio person from New York City, followed her because he was tape recording hypnosis sessions to try to break the control the CIA had over Candy, and he saved her life. But these pilots evidently didn't have those kind of friends helping them at the time. The important thing, as I say, is that this pilot, with all these people on the plane, was talking to Japan, and it says by an evil coincidence, he suspected nothing. He reported his new altitude. He made his last routine call, and the Soviet Union did every effort to attract attention, and the crew were occupied, busy talking to Tokyo. So there is a state of mind where there was no hysteria. And as I mentioned to you before, the 269 passengers are the amount of people mentioned over and over again that the cruel Russians knocked out of the air. They've only listed 200 names of people on the airplane. Now, usually the KL has a crew of 18 people. This time there were 29. There was no explanation why 11 extra. But if you add up the 18 and the 29, you still have 40 names not listed. And I would believe that out of these, there were 69 altogether where there was no name mentioned. And if you take away the crew, you still have 40 not listed. And the one hypothesis I have is that Larry MacDonald was with people, 40 people from our Defense Department and the military who maybe were to pick up information of some kind or experience and knew that the plane would be used in that way. They would be told, that the Russians would never shoot it down, and you would get out in time, which they almost did. They were pretty close to turning around after being 365 miles into the Soviet Union, and whammo, they're shot down, and a martyr is made of Larry MacDonald. The editorials that are written are already out on the street within 12 or 24 hours, and that same afternoon, Senator Henry Jackson who, as I say, lobbied for the Boeing airplanes and their contracts, had one press conference and then died of a heart attack. And that story will be going on, but I did want to finish certain points that I didn't have time to mention before. The People's World has an article by Con Hallinan, The Ghost of KAL Flight 007, Reagan's Gambit. And the gist of this is, of course, that the Soviet Union had accused us of having a spy plane, and they go on to say that this is important because Ronald Reagan, if he set this purposely, there would be a lot of implications. You can imagine sending 269 people to their death. He said the Soviets claimed the plane had low-frequency messages throughout the entire flight that it emanated, and these messages had to do with surveillance equipment that could be produced later. There are persistent rumors the Soviets have firm evidence that the flight was engaged in espionage. Now, this article by Hallinan says the persistent rumors that they have firm evidence. This may be the reason why Ronald Reagan's willing to sit down and talk about the Star Wars weapons, and now Richard Nixon says, let's share our Star War exploration, our space exploration with the Soviet Union to make sure we don't have Star Wars. I felt that the Soviet Union brought Nixon to China and to Russia, blackmailing him on the various political assassinations in this country. And it could be, I know Reagan isn't a nice guy, and he certainly likes the weapons contracts, and even if we had a halt in the weapons manufacturing or the deployment of them, he'd probably keep making them just to keep certain companies in business, such as Rockwell and Lockheed and Litton Industries and so forth. They depend upon the contracts of weapons. But if the Soviet Union has firm evidence that this was a spy plane and they're going to use it, they're going to stay silent and then pull the strings in, like you do fishing, and bring Ronald Reagan in. This article from People's World suggests that there is this evidence. Now, there were a lot of denials when the story came out from Great Britain about this being a spy plane that was linked to the Challenger. Of course, the Challenger went up the night before the Korean airline was shot down. It was simultaneous that the shuttle went up that exact time. The Los Angeles Herald has one denial, June the 12th. The U.S. denies a report that the Korean jetliner was testing Soviet radar. The man they used was Peter Russell of the White House, the spokesman. He said most Western experts said they believe the plane strayed accidentally when its navigational systems malfunctioned and that the spacecraft positions were a coincidence. Number one, the systems can't malfunction. It is totally impossible to malfunction unless the human factor wants it because of the three independent navigational systems. It didn't stray accidentally off because they had a lot of warning and circling, and the Soviet Union wanted to bring the plane down like the U-2. If it had spy equipment on it, it would be to their advantage, and it would be to the advantage of the pilot and co-pilots to bring the crew down rather than be shot in the ocean. I believe it would be to their advantage. Another quotation from that denial is from Lieutenant Colonel Ed Cook, C-O-O-K-E, the spokesman from the Defense Department, that said at the time of the accident, the Department of State and White House already told you there was no U.S. involvement. Well, J. Edgar Hoover told us there was no involvement in the FBI killing John Kennedy, and Alan Dulles said there was no role of the CIA in killing John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson said that he wasn't part of the cover-up of killing John Kennedy, and all those three were liars. So the denial is like Richard Nixon saying, I don't know who the people were at the Watergate Hotel. In fact, there's books on the Central Intelligence Agency, and part of their training is how to cover denial. So when they say in 1984 of June, we told you once there isn't any evidence, that doesn't mean the evidence doesn't exist. It just means we told you once, we'll tell you twice, we'll tell you once again. The Houston Post, June 20th, has some more quotations. Jim Oberg, a space engineer, he said that you're just trying to smear the space shuttle, that it's obviously false that the Challenger would be used for that. These stories are planted by the Soviet Union to defame NASA, the great institution, It was put together by Werner von Braun and top Nazis brought to this country. And they said from the Space Center the basic laws of nature and geography show that the shuttle could not have participated in any scenario that resulted in the KL tragedy. Now, how would we know by geography and nature what the shuttle was doing? They may have a set plan that they're putting on the air. You can call them up. And it may not be that at all. How do we know what the geography is telling you? They're not going to tell you when that thing is launched in one day and it's flying over there at that time what they photographed or didn't photograph. This fellow from the space station, Oberg, said the space shuttle orbits from Florida far to the south of the Soviet Union. However, we have planned soon to launch a shuttle from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, and that will be sent in polar orbit and would pass directly over the Soviet Union. I don't believe that a space shuttle launched in Florida stays in the southern belt. I'm sorry. That's too much of a lie, and I just don't believe it. I studied the Warren Commission too many years to believe that crock. Now, the San Francisco Examiner had another former astronaut, the head of NASA Naval Space Command, lives in Dahlgren, Virginia, Dahlgren, Virginia. He said that's preposterous that the Challenger was used, and another fellow from NASA says that's a preposterous story also. He said the space astronauts in the shuttle have taken photographs of the Soviet Union, and 3 months after the KAL, the astronaut on the 9th shuttle photographed the Soviet missile submarine port and fighter base where the Korean jet had flown over when it was shot down. Well, if you can do that 3 months after, you can do it the same night. That is just so much hogwash, and you really, as I say, have to read the commission hearings and the news coverage after every major event to know that they have a set answer, and they blame the Soviets for disinformation. One saying here, we didn't fly over there, and you know we didn't because you know our geography, and the other one saying, oh yeah, we went over there 3 months later. Well, add it up together, and I'm sure that the Space Challenger that went up just the day before the Korean airline went down could be used to fly over the area, and I don't believe that this would be published in the Defense Department magazine in Great Britain, a knowledgeable magazine. It's not like putting it in Gung Ho or Soldiers of Fortune. This is a serious magazine published after almost 1 year's research, and that man didn't write it alone. There were the articles in the New York Times. There was other evidence. There are a lot of people investigating this, and to show that it isn't clear-cut, they've now put Seymour Hersh on the case. Now, next week, I'll get back to some more of the important deaths of witnesses. We don't have time because we have 2 minutes here, but I do want to continue some of these questionable deaths, just as I mentioned that Thornwell this evening, the fellow who was given the LSD, who has a recurrent problems. He's well a while and he's sick a while, and all of a sudden he had an apparent epileptic fit and he drowned in a pool in California. One article, I'll maybe have time for one quick one. No, I'll tell you what, I won't do that. I'm going to summarize the KL because it's too confusing. I have the list of 4 important, I think they're important deaths in the last 2 weeks, and we may as well go down the line with those and why I think they were possible murders. I keep bringing up the point that in order for Hitler to come into power in 1933, the Weimar Republic had a series of thousands and thousands of deaths of important people in political parties and judges and lawyers and public citizens. Some were communists, some were writers, and people in political office that had to be wiped out in order to have a successful election where the Nazi Party would be elected. And they cleaned out very well any opposition to their party, and I believe that this is what's happening here in the United States as well as the death squads in South America, Central America. If the same people are doing these things in South and Central America, such as Henry Kissinger and his gang, then why couldn't Jerry Ford with the Warren Commission be part of the death squad cover-up in this country? Silly question, because I know he is. I'll be back with you. This is Mae Brussell. It's KZUM. No, I'm not going to do it so fast. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, and it is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.